I've always been fascinated by thunderstorms. Growing up in Florida, where they were as common as the heat itself, I found comfort in the chaos of the sky. Even now, as an adult, the crack of thunder and the flicker of lightning stir something deep inside me. It seems my 6-year-old son inherited this love. Anytime the sky darkens and the first rumble rolls across the horizon, he knows exactly what we'll do next. Head to the backyard gazebo and watch the storm roll in. One hot August night, as the storm approached, the first flash of lightning lit up our living room, casting wild shadows across the walls. My son sprang to his feet, his eyes wide with excitement. "Let's go outside," he shouted, already heading for the back door. I followed him, laughing as we ran into the rain, getting drenched in seconds, but neither of us cared. This was our ritual. Our gazebo was more than just a place to stay dry. It was our retreat from the world. A few wicker sofas sat under the cover, facing the sprawling backyard that stretched out toward the thick line of woods at the edge of the property. A mini bar and a small fire pit added to the cozy atmosphere, and I often turned on the TV for some background noise. But tonight, the storm was the only show we needed. We sat down, letting the sounds of the rain and the rolling thunder wash over us. The air was thick and heavy, the storm inching closer with every passing second. The gaps between lightning and thunder shrank, each flash illuminating the yard like daylight for a brief moment before plunging it back into darkness. The woods at the far end of the yard seemed to pulse with each strike, the trees swaying under the weight of the storm. I leaned back, feeling that familiar mix of awe and peace that always came with a good storm. But there was something else in the air that night, something I couldn't quite place. The storm felt different. Suddenly, after a particularly bright flash of lightning, my son gasped and pointed out into the yard. "Someone's standing out there," he whispered, his voice trembling with fear. At first, I didn't take him seriously. The storm was intense, and I figured the combination of wind and shadows had played a trick on his eyes. But as I glanced at his face, pale and wide-eyed, I knew he wasn't kidding. I stood up and walked to the edge of the gazebo, squinting into the darkness, waiting for the next strike of lightning to prove or disprove his fear. The rain poured down in sheets, and the trees at the back of the yard swayed like shadowy figures in the distance. Seconds passed in agonizing silence before the next flash tore through the sky, illuminating the yard in an instant. My heart nearly stopped. There, just at the tree line, was a figure. A person. They were standing completely still, facing us. My stomach twisted into knots. I grabbed my son's hand and told him to run inside and turn on the backyard lights. He bolted without hesitation, leaving me alone, staring at the spot where I had seen the figure. The darkness returned, and I waited, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. A few moments later, the backyard lights flickered on, flooding the yard in a harsh, artificial glow. I scanned every inch of the space where the figure had been, but there was nothing. The person, whoever they were, had vanished. The rain continued to pound against the roof of the gazebo, and I stood there, staring out into the void, hoping the next flash of lightning would reveal something, anything, but each flash came and went, and the figure never returned. I felt uneasy as I hurried back inside, locking the door behind me. My wife was waiting, her face a mix of concern and confusion. She had overheard everything and asked, "Should we call the police?" I hesitated, not wanting to scare her or my son any more than they already were. "No," I lied. "I saw them leave. They're gone now." I wanted to believe my own words, but the pit in my stomach told me otherwise. We tried to settle down and distract ourselves by watching a movie, but the storm raged on outside, and the tension in the room was thick. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind against the windows made me jump. I kept glancing toward the back door, half expecting to see something or someone lurking there. Later that night, my son came padding into the living room, his face pale and his eyes wide with fear. "Someone's at my window?" he whispered, clutching his blanket like a lifeline. My wife and I exchanged a look, our disbelief quickly turning to dread. We rushed to his bedroom, my heart pounding in my chest. I stood at the doorway, staring at the window, waiting for the next flash of lightning. The seconds stretched on painfully, my son trembling behind me. When the lightning finally came, the window lit up. But there was no one there, no figure, no face, nothing. But I believed him. I knew someone had been out there. Despite my wife's protests, I grabbed a bat from the closet and stormed outside into the pouring rain. The wind howled and the storm seemed to swallow everything, but the lights were still on, illuminating the yard in an eerie glow. Each step felt heavier, the weight of dread clinging to me as I made my way around the house. I started with the front yard, carefully checking each corner, each shadow. Nothing. The rain drenched me to the bone, but I pushed on, my grip tightening around the bat as I circled to the back. The storm's fury made it difficult to hear anything but the pounding of rain, the crack of thunder, and the occasional flash of lightning that painted the yard in brief, blinding light. As I made my way around the side of the house, my heart nearly stopped. There, half hidden, peering around the corner, was the figure. Their face was partially visible under a dark hood, just a sliver of skin reflecting the dim light. It wasn't the face of someone seeking shelter. It was the face of someone watching, waiting. My fear twisted into anger. I screamed, charging forward with the bat raised, ready to defend my family, but as I rounded the corner, they were gone, just like that. No footsteps, no sound, nothing but the rain and the distant rumble of thunder. I stood there, soaked and shaken, my chest heaving as I scanned the yard. The figure had vanished into the storm as if they had never been there at all. I lingered outside for what felt like an eternity, desperately searching for any sign of the intruder. But there was nothing. Just the storm and the dark woods, looming at the edge of the property. Defeated, I trudged back inside. Dripping water all over the floor. My wife and son were huddled together in the living room, their faces pale with worry. "It's okay," I lied, forcing a weak smile. I chased them off. My wife's eyes widened when I mentioned it was a man, her unease deepening. I quickly locked every door and window, pulling the blinds shut so that no one could see in or out. The storm outside showed no signs of letting up, but inside, the house felt strangely quiet. Too quiet. That night, our son slept in our bed. He was terrified, clinging to me and my wife like a lifeline. I couldn't blame him. I hadn't seen what he hadn't felt the icy chill of looking up and seeing a face staring back at me through the window. But the fear in his eyes told me everything I needed to know. Even though the figure never returned that night, the image of that hooded silhouette stayed with me. Every time I closed my eyes, I could see them, lurking at the corner of my house, watching us through the storm. I don't know what they wanted or why they were there, but one thing was clear. They knew where we lived, and that's what haunts me the most. Where I live, rain is a rare blessing. When it does happen, it feels like the whole town stops to savor it. Kids dash outside, splashing through puddles, while farmers gaze hopefully at the sky, grateful for the relief it brings to their crops. For the rest of us, it's a peaceful break from the monotony of dry days. But the last big thunderstorm, that one will stay with me forever, though not for the reasons you'd think. It started like any other storm. My friends and I were gaming online, chatting and laughing, when a deafening crack of thunder roared through all our mics at once. It was so loud I actually flinched, thinking it might have been a gunshot or some explosion nearby. My room lit up with the flash of lightning, and out of reflex I jumped up from my bed and looked out the window. That's when I saw him. Across the street, barely visible through the rain, stood a man. He wore a gray hoodie, the kind that blends into any crowd, with faded jeans to match. He wasn't particularly big, not bulky or threatening at first glance, but there was something off about him. His face was mostly obscured by his hood, and I couldn't tell if he was looking at me or just lost in the storm. Still, The sight of him standing there in the pouring rain sent a chill down my spine. Why wasn't he moving? Who just stands in the middle of a storm like that? I watched for what felt like an eternity before he finally turned and started walking down the street. Relief washed over me, but it didn't last long. Something about that moment stayed with me, an unsettling feeling that lingered long after he disappeared into the shadows of the rain-soaked night. Later that night, I couldn't shake the need to go outside and feel the storm for myself. It's something I always did. Stand under the porch roof, letting the rain's rhythm calm me while lightning split the sky in quick, flickering flashes. As I stepped out, the cool air was thick with the smell of wet earth, and I let myself just enjoy the rare moment of calm. But as I glanced down the street, my heart skipped a beat. He was back, standing at the far corner of the street in the same gray hoodie, soaked to the bone. His posture hadn't changed, and even from that distance, I could feel his presence weighing on me. A part of me wanted to believe it was just a coincidence. After all, it was rare for anyone to experience rain here. Maybe he was just taking it in like I was. But something about him, just standing there, alone in the storm, felt wrong. I tried to shake it off. People do strange things all the time, right? No need to freak out. I stayed outside for a few more minutes, watching the rainfall, trying to convince myself there was nothing to worry about. But that nagging feeling wouldn't let go. When I finally decided to go back inside, I threw one last glance down the street. The man was gone. That creeping sense of unease grew stronger as I made my way back to my room. Just as I sat down, my phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. 2 texts, actually. Have you forgotten? I know you didn't. My stomach dropped. My first thought was that it had to be a prank. My friends loved to mess with me, and maybe they knew I was spooked. I opened the group chat and asked if anyone was trying to freak me out. They all swore they weren't, which didn't make me feel any better. After a few moments of denial, I decided to believe them and let it go. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. It wasn't long after that when the doorbell rang. My pulse quickened. Who would be here at this time? It was way too late for visitors. I checked my phone. 12:19 a.m. Definitely not the time for someone to just drop by. I crept to the window, lifting the blinds just enough to peer through. The rain was coming down so hard it blurred everything, like a thick, impenetrable curtain. I couldn't see anything, just water pouring down. Suddenly, another loud crack of thunder boomed, and I flinched, knocking my head against the window with a dull thud. Just as I was about to move away, I saw it, a figure dashing away from the front door. My heart froze. It was him. The man from earlier. I knew it was him. Something inside me just knew. I wanted to call the cops. I really did, but what would I even say? That some guy had been standing outside my house, that I got a couple of weird texts from an unknown number? It sounded ridiculous, even to me. They'd never take me seriously. So I locked every door, double-checked the windows, and crawled into bed, hoping I'd be able to fall asleep, but sleep didn't come easy. Hours later, a deafening thunderclap jolted me awake. My heart was already racing, my mind fuzzy with confusion when I heard it. A loud bang on my window. I froze. My whole body locked up, the sheets suddenly feeling suffocating. I wanted to hide under them like a kid afraid of the dark, but some twisted part of me needed to know. Slowly, I leaned over and pulled the blinds, just a fraction, just enough to see. And there he was. His hands were pressed flat against the glass, his face shrouded in the shadow of his hoodie, but I could see enough. His mouth. Oh God, his mouth. It was stretched into this grotesque, impossibly wide grin, lips pulled back far beyond what should be humanly possible. His teeth gleamed unnaturally in the faint light. I couldn't see his eyes, but I could feel them on me, burning through the darkness, staring straight into my soul. That smile, twisted and wrong, was like he knew something I didn't. I wanted to scream, to move, to do anything, but I couldn't. I was paralyzed, caught in his gaze. as the rain pounded around us. Then without a word, without any warning, he stepped back, his eyes never leaving the window. And then, just like that, he walked away, fading into the storm. For a long time, I just sat there, too terrified to move. I don't even remember falling asleep. But when I woke up, slumped over in my chair, it all came rushing back. I almost convinced myself it was just some horrific nightmare, a product of my mind playing tricks on me after everything that had happened. Then I pulled up the blinds. A small piece of paper was taped to the window, fluttering slightly in the breeze. My stomach dropped. Hands shaking, I reached out and grabbed it. There were only 3 words written on it, but they've haunted me ever since. Have you forgotten? I haven't seen the man again, and I pray I never will. But sometimes, when the sky darkens and the rumble of thunder echoes in the distance, I catch myself glancing out the window. My heart skips a beat every time, fearing that I'll see him there again, grinning in the rain, waiting for me. It was one of those stormy nights where all you want is to be curled up in bed, warm and dry. But I was stuck working late, and by the time I finally left the office, it was already midnight. The storm had only gotten worse, rain pounding down so hard it felt like the sky was trying to drown the earth. I climbed into my old 2005 Ford Fusion, a car I knew wasn't built for weather like this, and reluctantly started my drive home. The windshield wipers were going full blast, but they barely made a difference. I could only see a few feet in front of me, and I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. I slowed down to 40 miles per hour, far below the speed limit, but even then I was barely keeping control. The road was empty, eerily so. No headlights in the distance, no taillights ahead of me. Just me, my car, and the storm. The sound of rain drumming against the roof mixed with the swish of the wipers. It should have been comforting, but something about the quiet highway unsettled me. I kept my eyes glued to the road, trying to make out any turns or obstacles through the sheets of rain. That's when I saw it, a figure in white, darting across the street. It happened so fast I almost didn't register it. A person running from the woods on one side of the road and disappearing into the trees on the other. I barely had time to react. I slammed on the brakes, but the car swerved violently, tires screeching against the slick road. My heart pounded as the car spun out of control, sliding off the road. The front end slammed headfirst into a tree with a sickening crunch, the force of the impact throwing me against the airbag. For a few moments I just sat there, dazed. My ears were ringing and my head throbbed. The rain was still coming down hard, and through the blur of the downpour, I tried to make sense of what had just happened. Did I really see someone? Or was it just a trick of the storm? It took a while for the shock to wear off. But when it did, the reality of the situation hit me hard. My car was wrecked, completely totaled. The front end was crumpled around the tree, and I was alone in the middle of nowhere. My first thought was of the figure I had swerved to avoid. Who were they? Why were they out here in the dead of night during a storm like this? It didn't make sense. I scanned the road, the woods on either side, but there was no one. Not a single soul. Panic started to creep in. I grabbed my phone, hands shaking, and tried calling my brother. No answer. I tried my sister next, but still nothing. I felt trapped, helpless. With no other options, I called my dad. My voice wavered as I explained what had happened, and he tried to calm me down, telling me to stay inside the car and keep the doors locked. He promised he was on his way and would be there in about 15 minutes. The rain kept battering the car, relentless and loud, almost drowning out my thoughts. I kept glancing at the windows, my nerves on edge. Every flicker of light, every shifting shadow made me jump. My heart was racing so fast it felt like it might beat out of my chest. There was no sign of the figure I had seen, but that almost made it worse. Was someone out there, watching me, waiting? I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I called roadside assistance, trying to distract myself, They said a tow truck was on its way, but it would take at least 20 minutes in this weather. Time seemed to crawl by. And after 10 minutes, I started getting anxious. I texted my dad to see how far away he was, hoping for some kind of reassurance. That's when I noticed movement from the corner of my eye. My stomach flipped as I slowly turned to the right. Standing right outside my passenger side window was a man, drenched from head to toe. His clothes clung to him, soaking wet, and his face was pressed up against the glass, inches from mine. I gasped, freezing in place. His mouth was open, hanging in a disturbing O shape, and his eyes were narrowed like he was trying to see inside. He lifted his hands, pressing his palms against the window, and started rubbing them back and forth, smearing the rain across the glass. It was as if he was trying to wipe away the water, but the motion was slow, deliberate. Almost too slow. My whole body went cold. My instincts screamed at me to get away, but there was nowhere to go. I was trapped in the car with this stranger, inches away from me. My voice barely worked, but I managed to shout at him, "Go away!" I yelled, but he didn't even flinch. His mouth stayed frozen in that horrifying O, his hands still dragging across the glass. Then he reached for the door handle. I fumbled for the lock, making sure everything was secured, my breath coming in quick, shallow bursts. The door didn't budge, but that didn't stop him. He kept trying, pulling on the handle again and again, his fingers trembling with the effort. When that didn't work, he pounded on the window, hard enough to rattle the car. Each hit felt like it was shaking my bones. I grabbed my phone, hands shaking uncontrollably, and called my dad again. As soon as he answered, I practically screamed into the phone, telling him someone was trying to get into the car. My dad's voice was frantic, telling me not to open the doors under any circumstances. He was close, just a few minutes away, but it felt like an eternity. The man outside wasn't giving up. He raised his elbow and started smashing it against the window, harder and harder, his expression never changing. That open mouth, those squinted eyes, it was like a nightmare come to life. I could hear the glass creaking under the pressure, threatening to give way any second. And then, just as I thought it would all be over, I saw headlights cutting through the rain. I was spiraling into full-blown panic as the man's pounding became more violent. His elbow slammed into the window again and again, the glass groaning under the strain. My dad's voice echoed through the phone, yelling at me to hold on, to stay locked inside, but I could barely focus. The rain was deafening, mixing with the steady thudding of his fists. The whole car felt like it was shaking with each hit, and I was sure the glass would shatter any second. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying for it to end, when suddenly, I saw them. Headlights, bright through the storm. My dad's car came into view, and just like that, the man stopped. His fist hovered in the air for a second before he turned, frozen by the sight of my dad pulling up behind me. For a moment, everything was still. Then, as my dad stepped out of his car, the man bolted. He took off towards the woods like a wild animal, his legs slipping in the mud. But my dad wasn't about to let him get away. I watched in shock as my dad chased after him, catching up faster than I expected. The man barely made it a few feet before my dad lunged, tackling him to the ground. They both crashed into the mud, the rain pouring over them, but my dad didn't stop. He pinned the man down, throwing punches, as he wrestled him into submission. Through the downpour, I could see the man's white clothes quickly turning red as blood streamed down his face. My dad wasn't holding back, his fists flying as the rain washed the blood into the dirt. I couldn't move. I just sat there, watching in stunned silence. The man, the one who had just been trying to break into my car, barely fought back. He just lay there, his face still twisted in that haunting O shape, his eyes squinting up at my dad through the rain. I fumbled for my phone and dialed 911, my voice shaking as I told them what was happening. By the time the tow truck arrived, my dad was still holding the man down, both of them soaked to the bone. The tow truck driver looked confused, probably expecting a routine job, not a bloodied man being held in the mud. The police arrived shortly after, and the sight of them handcuffing the man brought an overwhelming sense of relief. They identified him as Marcus Green. I didn't ask for details, but I overheard enough to know that the charges were serious, far more than just trying to break into my car. The police wouldn't say much beyond that, and honestly, I didn't want to know. I didn't go to court. I couldn't bring myself to face him again, to see that twisted, unnatural expression on his face. Even now, I still see him in my mind, that soaking wet man in white, his mouth frozen in that awful shape, his eyes squinting as he tried to get into my car, the way he rubbed his hands on the window, like he was trying to get inside, like he had been waiting for me. I'll never forget it. Even though he's behind bars, I still lock my doors the moment I get into my car. I still feel like he's watching me, waiting for the next chance. That night will haunt me forever.